Hello, everyone. John Melby with Become Demand Driven. And today I want to walk you through the basics of demand driven material requirements planning in a module or a section we're calling basic training. A little more advanced than the overview that we do, gets into a little more details and takes a little bit longer time, of course. So thank you for joining me today on this journey, and let's get started. DDMRP, demand-driven material requirements planning. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the conventional planning challenges that we face, that everybody faces, the rise of the VUCA world, that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, the bullwhip effect and the damage that it does. And then we're going to go through the 5 steps of demand-driven material requirements planning. And then we're going to see what's possible once we solve this basic problem we have of inventory management. MRP, Material Requirements Planning, the traditional processes developed by a handful of people, but Joe Orlicke is the guy who wrote the book in 1975. And what MRP, or Material Requirements Planning, was going to give us is time-phased planning, level-by-level bill of materials explosion, and dependent demand planning. Time-phased planning means if we can see a due date in the future for the item we are selling, and we know what the components are through the bill of materials and the explosion therein, we can now plan our dependent demand. What is dependent demand? The understanding that the end item might be something like a bicycle. And so we're going to sell one bicycle. We know we need 2 wheels because every bicycle has 2 wheels. It has 1 handlebar. It has 1 seat. It has a gear sprocket, all of the components that go into that. We don't need to list them all separately. We say we have demand for 1 bicycle. That is independent demand. And then we have the dependent demand of all the components. So this is a big change from what we had prior to MRP. And the fact that we have computers now, and 1975, computers started to come out, we could do all of these kinds of things automatically that we couldn't do in the past. The benefits were going to be, or of material requirements planning, is that we would get component synchronization. We would have a reduction in inventory, and we would have improved priorities. Because if we can understand the different lead times and when we need the products, we can understand when we need to place orders so that they will arrive precisely when we need them, and it will all be coordinated through what we call a due date. And Joe in 1975, I won't read this whole statement, but he said, "I have no doubt whatever that it will be the way of life in the future." 1975. Of course, it did become the way of life for planning. It was conceived in the 1950s, put into computer code in the 1960s, and it was commercialized in the 1970s. By 1990, most manufacturers of even a modest scale had some form of an MRP system. But something is terribly wrong. Most planners and buyers mistrust their tools. We have spreadsheets everywhere, and often independently created and unmonitored or unchecked for errors. Best in class, still using spreadsheets. I would venture to say that at this moment, more than 90% of all companies in their inventory management tools have spreadsheet use. They're limited in capability, scalability, and transferability. Most of us don't share the methods we're using, and maybe we don't even agree with the people sitting next to us as to what the right method is. And often there are errors in our spreadsheets that go unnoticed because it can be relatively small error, but it still drives large changes in our output. The VUCA world, I mentioned this earlier, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world is getting more and more uncertain. There's more and more complex. There's more nodes of transport in our supply chains, and it's more and more ambiguous to know, should we act in this way or should we act in that way? What should we do? Because we can't guarantee the results. What supply chain looks like today is vastly different from what it was in 1965. We have more complexity. The product life cycles are short. Customers are not willing to wait. That's the customer tolerance time. Product complexity and customization and variety, all high. We have many long lead time parts. Forecast accuracy is low. We have pressure to hold less inventory, and we have transactional friction. Transactional friction used to be high. Today it's low. What do we mean by transactional friction? Pretty straightforward. If you go out to Amazon today, you can buy what you need or what you don't need with one click. In 1965, there was a much longer process, often involving a mail order catalog in the mail, where you had to fill out a form and make sure you added all the numbers correctly, put a check in there for the amount of the dollar amount that was required, and mail it via the post office in order to place an order. Today, you can do all that in a few seconds online. The implications, therefore, for inventory management: supply chains are longer and more fragmented. At the same time, the customer tolerance times have dropped dramatically. And that means that we have to hold inventory at some strategic point in order to keep or grow sales. We understand we need to hold inventory because we know that the customer will not wait for us to go purchase our raw materials, which might take 6, 9, or even 12 months or longer. They will not wait that length of time to get the product they want to order. Therefore, we have to hold inventory somewhere. Why? Because if we have inventory at a certain spot, we can guess the time period or predict the time period much more accurately from that point to our finished product. And then we determine that if the customer is willing to wait that period of time, then that is enough that we strategic position inventory in those locations. What also happens is that our planning horizons are much more remote from the actual demand, meaning we have to make a longer range forecast. And there are more products with shorter lifespans to manage. Often they're using common components and common resources in the production. This means that managing stock positions effectively is what we have to do in order to effectively manage capital and our equipment or our resources. It also means that detailed item level forecasting is much more difficult. And we know the 3 rules of forecast. They start out wrong. The longer the range, the more wrong they are. And the more detailed requirements, the more wrong they will be. And the conventional approach isn't doing very well with all of this new information that we need to take into account. So what's happening? I think we can all agree that there's 2 universal points of inventory. Point A, where we have too little, and point B, where we have too much. And it doesn't take a genius to understand that where we want to be with our inventory is in between too little and too much, which sounds very subjective. How do we understand, and ambiguous, how do we understand too little and too much? Now, too little is relatively straightforward. 0, of course, is too little, but sometimes 20 or 50 could be too little as well. So a little bit of subjective. The too much, on the other hand, also very subjective, or on the other end, is also very subjective. What is too much inventory? And if that number keeps moving around, because when I talk to the finance team, I get a different impression of what's too much than when I talk to the operations team. So we have not only an ambiguous situation, we also have disagreement among the players. But let's go back to the point that we want to keep inventory in between too little and too much. And that means between those 2 points, there's an optimal range that we are trying to maintain. But most companies exhibit what we call the bimodal distribution. Most of the inventory is either too low or too high. So we have inventory, a lot of part numbers that have too little inventory, and a lot of part numbers that have too much, and almost nothing in this middle optimal range. So no one is happy. And every time MRP runs, which is often overnight, so once a day, when it runs, the parts that we had too much of move to having too little of, and the parts that we had too little of move to having too much. 90% of companies report this problem. And the 3 bottom line effects for companies is that we have chronic shortages. At the very same time, we have excessive inventory, and we have high expedite expenses and waste. But the real problem is at a higher level. The real problem is something we call the bullwhip effect, originally called the Forrester effect, named after the person who discovered it or first coined the phrase, and we now call it the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect is essentially an extreme change in a supply position upstream in the supply chain, generated by a small change in the demand downstream in the supply chain. What that means is a little change from our customers translates into a large change at the other end of the supply chain. We overreact. And what happens that we need to figure out what to do is transference and amplification of variability. I wish I could tell you we figured out how to eliminate variability. We did not. But we need to figure out how to stop the transference and amplification of variability in both directions, both in the demand signal distortion and in the supply continuity variability. The more parts we have in the supply chain, the worse the effect. And the true solution has to deal with both directions of the distortion. So we have demand signal distortion and we have supply continuity variability. The result of that is the material's not ready at the needed time. Why do we have demand signal distortion? Well, we're using signals with known error. We're using latent signals. Often we talk in weekly numbers or even monthly numbers, but we produce in daily numbers. So we're not aligned on the way we talk about our requirements. We often use oversimplified signals where we are not transacting a change in the product from point A to point B, but we are holding inventory there. We call that phantom bill of materials or a pseudo bill of materials. And we have changing and conflicting signals. So if we fix the distortion in the demand signal, is the bullwhip solved? No, because we need to stop the bullwhip in both directions. If we go back to the material not ready at the needed time, the point is that MRP plans never properly synchronize. And this is the core problem. Why do we use latent signals? Because we talk in weekly buckets. We're attempting to make 400 items this week, or let's use 500 items this week. That might be 100 a day. Or it might be 500 in one day. But because we talk about it in weekly buckets and we actually produce in different ways, we produce in daily numbers, there's a disconnect. We have oversimplified signals where bill of materials are flattened and transactions are not made, even though we are putting those parts into a location of inventory. And what do all these things cause? What we call system nervousness. It's why we have expedite reports, or what we used to call pull in and push out reports. And that causes nervousness, changes every day in our signals. Why is that? Because the adjustments have to occur as the actual demand becomes known. We're starting with a forecast that we know is not going to be exactly correct. So when the real number is finally known, and the timing and the number are finally known, then we have to put those into the system. But when we start, we're using forecasts. Why are we using forecasts? We have to use something. There's no magic answer here. We have to put something in, and it's the best thing we have at the time. But we need those forecasts because the cumulative manufacturing and the procurement times are much longer than the customer is willing to wait. So we have to put in some number in order to work. MRP treats everything as dependent. Why do MRP plans never properly synchronize? Because we have supply variability, and the transference of that supply variability causes delay accumulation across the dependent networks. Why is that? Because the MRP plans, both the timing and the quantity requirements, are built using all dependencies. Everything is dependent on everything else. But did you know that the basic MRP equation has not changed since 1965? MRP was never designed to manage stock. It was designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator. That's why it always tries to net to zero, which means it always tries to have nothing left over when you're done with that particular order. And MRP only produces a realistic schedule when the three basic assumptions are met. Demand is known and does not change. There's sufficient time to accomplish all of the required activities within the customer tolerance time. And in reality, the demand time fence is supposed to be set to the customer tolerance time. And assumption number 3 is that there is no variability in execution. Everything has to go exactly right. I'm going to add another piece in here, and that is, I'll make a bold statement. Everyone knows that when you run out of a part, you add safety stock. In the original MRP that was introduced in 1965, safety stock did not exist. That was not a thing, because MRP is the perfect make-to-order calculator. Assuming you can buy exactly what you need, you will end up with nothing left when you're done, because everything will go exactly according to plan, and there will be no changes. So we had to invent safety stock because traditional MRP struggled right out of the box in 1965. And we put safety stock into it. And safety stock has become almost the only thing that we can do to try and handle different problems and variabilities that come up. We add safety stock. And that throws in another little nugget. The unavoidable outcome of adding safety stock is to raise inventory. And yet every manager in every company, every leader in every company is suggesting that your job is to reduce inventory. So we have a system where the only tool we have, increases inventory. At the same time, we're tasked with reducing inventory. There's an entire book called Precisely Wrong: Why Conventional Planning Fails and How to Fix It, by Carol Patak and Chad Smith, the two founders of the demand-driven methodology. If you have people who believe that traditional planning can work if we just work harder, this book would be a great read for them. MRP does not fit the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we live in. What do we mean by that? Well, we know that there's not enough time to perform all the tasks related to distribute, produce, and procure end items, the cumulative lead time, within the customer tolerance time, within the time the customer is willing to wait. So the question is, what can we do? But the next bullet points talk about what we actually try and attempt to do. We set a planning time fence, at least one cumulative lead time into the future, sometimes more, where we try and make sure that the the planning that we set up, the idea, the plan that we've put in place cannot change in that window of time. Then we use demand predictions, which we call forecasts, for that future period to launch supply orders and schedule activity on our equipment, on our resources, using planned orders. It's all based on a demand prediction. And then we attempt to see that unchangeable or frozen schedule through to the end. And we believe that we're buying ourselves time that we need to stabilize manufacturing and guarantee the supply of necessary product. But there's a challenge to this. Cumulative lead time, if we look at our sample, raw materials, production facility, shipping, and distribution center graphic here, we've got 40 to 50 days in that cumulative lead time. So we've got demand signal distortion and we've got supply continuity variability running rampant through that time period. And this is what we call push and promote. So what happens? Let's look at the reality of what happens. We've got a long period of time for our production and raw materials procurement, and we're looking 50 days into the future to try and predict exactly what we need. And we've got a 50% chance of being right on that. And then we've got a much shorter window, let's call it 5 days, for the customer tolerance time, the actual demand signal. And that should be 100% accurate. Most of the time when people place an order, that order stays. And so the way we look at this is that we've got actual demand and our capabilities. And if we think about that actual demand signal, our capability is very close to the actual demand. And by capability, we mean our ability to schedule the resources and react to changes in actual demand. That's in a very short window. But by using that forecast that's 50 days out into the future, we push our capability farther away from the actual demand. And the guaranteed effects is that we will have too much inventory. We will also have shortages, and we will also have costly expedites and scheduled break-ins. And in a bonus effect, we have lots of spreadsheets in order to try and figure out all the discrepancies. What are we missing? Why do we believe the only way to improve planning is to get a better crystal ball? Why do we accept that MRP's rules and assumptions are unchangeable? Maybe if we amend a set of rules, that we could attack the problem differently at a more fundamental level. This leads into my introduction to demand-driven material requirements planning. Introduced in 2011 by the Demand-Driven Institute, after 15 years of research and application, it is a method to model, plan, and manage supply chains, protecting and promoting flow of relevant information and materials. And DDMRP uses strategic decoupling points, both to drive supply order generation, in other words, purchase orders and manufacturing orders, and the management of those open orders, in other words, the expediting or the decision whether or not to expedite, separately throughout a supply chain. Built on the pillars of material requirements planning, distribution requirements planning, lean, theory of constraints, and Six Sigma, with 4 pieces of innovation, and I would maybe add a 5th of the packaging and putting it together in the way that it's put together. We end up with position, protect, pull, and adapt. The 5 components, the first one is position. The first question we ask is, where should we place inventory? Where do we place inventory to decouple our supply chains? The second is to set how much inventory, and how are we going to determine how much inventory sits in those strategic positions. The third is that we have to dynamically adjust the buffers. We cannot set them and forget them. we have to dynamically adjust and keep adapting the buffers to the world that we live in. Step number 4 is demand-driven planning. We have a methodology that we're going to talk through as to how we make our decisions, and that information can now be used mostly right out of the system. In today's world, we get our output from traditional MRP, and we know we have to put that into a spreadsheet and massage those numbers. We cannot use the output from our MRP systems as it comes out. With DDMRP, we're going to be able to do that. And step number 5, or component number 5, is the visible and collaborative execution, where we can see, all of us can see how we are doing in maintaining our buffers, and when we need to expedite, that's all visible to everyone through the system. So the first step, strategic decoupling. We're going to place inventory in such a way, somewhere in the supply chain, either within the product structure or across the supply chain, we're going to place inventory to decouple our supply chain. And what that means is we put, in this case, we put a buffer between the component supplier and the subassembler, and that will stop the transfer and amplification of variability in both directions. It also shortens the planning horizons, and our lead times compress. What does that mean? That means that if I know I have inventory here, and that's the job, is to make sure we have inventory in this buffer, then I can plan this side of the buffer without regard to small problems or bullwhips that are happening on this side. I can plan each side separately. This side is planned in order to maintain this inventory, and this side is planned to get to the end item. It shortens and compresses our lead times and our planning horizons. How do we determine where we're going to place inventory? 6 different factors that help us understand, should we place inventory there or not. Customer tolerance time, how long is a customer willing to wait before they go and find somebody else who can provide that product. The market potential lead time, is there a chance to either capture additional business or allow a price increase because our lead time is much less than our competition. The sales order visibility horizon is the time in which we typically become aware of sales orders. In other words, does the customer give us the lead time we've asked for? Do they give us 2 days or 12 days? What kind of time frame do we become aware that we have a sales order? External variability, demand variability, and supply variability. And we talk about this relatively, roughly right instead of precisely wrong. So we talk about high, medium, or low variability, and we think about it in terms of the demand variability has much more impact on the end item buffer and the supply variability has much more impact on the raw material buffers. Assuming we have both of those buffers, we can think about the demand variability and the supply variability impacting differently at each end. Inventory leverage and flexibility. Where are the places in our bill of materials that gives us the most options? In other words, if you have a part that goes into many products and you have a part that only goes into one product, well, we have inventory leverage in that one and flexibility in the one that goes into many products. And critical operation protection. Do we have a capacity limit where either quality can be compromised or our on-time delivery can be compromised? If we lose time on that operation, we probably want to put a buffer of inventory in front of it. So 6 different ways to think about our where we're going to place inventory and why we decide where we're going to place inventory in those locations. If we look at the combination between MRP and DDMRP, got the left side where everything is coupled, and we understand that Everything has to happen in this 8 weeks exactly as planned in order to hit that customer due date. But on DDMRP, we're strategically decoupled, which means if I have inventory here, then I can think about a lead time of 1 week to the customer. And then I have a 3-week lead time to produce everything as expected in here. And I have a 4-week lead time to separately look at my raw materials and make sure that those are stocked. Separate some of the chaos, because if something goes wrong here at Weld, or our outsource plating operation loses power for 1 hour in the day, it doesn't disrupt everything else because we have buffers that allow us to decouple. What does decoupling mean? Let's take a minute to talk about that. Decoupling means we are disconnecting the rate of use from the rate of supply. I think about the water heater in the house. That disconnects. If everybody turned on the hot water at once, and we didn't have a hot water heater, we would all be scrambling trying to figure out when are we going to get some hot water. But so we decouple, and we put a tank in our basement or somewhere in the house that holds some hot water, so that at any given time, if 2 people are trying to use hot water, there isn't a scramble. There isn't a shortage. It handles that. But it doesn't handle indefinitely. If everyone turned on every faucet in the house, we would run out of hot water quicker. MRP, again, never designed to decouple. It makes everything dependent, forcing longer planning horizons and variability accumulation. What we're learning is that the decoupling points protect each other, and they work together. And what happens is, because we've decoupled the lead time to make the end item, because we have the buffered component, this lead time gets smaller and allows us to have less inventory here because we have inventory here. And because we have inventory here, this critical subcomponent in the middle can have less inventory as well. So we protect each other because our decoupled lead time in between the buffers is what helps us to size the buffer. And if we can reduce those decoupled lead times, we will reduce the amount of inventory that we need to hold at each one of those locations. And what that means is, we've already talked about a decoupled lead time. We need a new kind of lead time. And that decoupled lead time is used to compress the lead times to the required ranges, to determine realistic due dates when someone calls and asks you what's the due date or what's the time frame it will take to produce that item. It helps us to set the decoupling point buffer levels properly, and it helps us to find the high value inventory leverage points for decoupling. We need a new kind of lead time for manufactured items, because our traditional planning systems only know about certain types of lead time. In this case, we have looked at this product structure, and we have inserted decoupling points or buffers in strategic locations, but not everywhere. The manufacturing lead time is the total time required to manufacture an item, regardless of the lower level lead times. So FPB has a manufacturing lead time of 1, 101 has a lead time of 3, 207 has a lead time of 3, 310 has a lead time of 2. All of those have to happen exactly as planned in order for that total lead time to line up. And the delay accumulations that we will have on those non-decoupled legs guarantee that those manufacturing lead times will not be met. The second kind of lead time that traditional MRP knows about is cumulative lead time. And that's the longest planned length of time to accomplish the activity in question. That means if we follow these through, we would say 1 + 3 + 3 + 2 + 30. That guarantees that we're going to have a gross overestimation, because we know we have inventory in certain spots. Decoupled lead time essentially is a qualified cumulative lead time, the longest unprotected, unbuffered sequence in the bill of materials. And we can see them outlined here. There's one over here and one over here. FPB has a decoupled lead time of 1 + 3 + 3 + 2. And 201 has a decoupled lead time of 4 + 5. Both of them add up to 9. So we have a 9-day decoupled lead time. And anytime we have a non-buffered item on the decoupled lead time chain, the decoupled lead time will be greater than the manufacturing lead time. Why is this important? Well, what's important is understanding where can we place inventory that will impact the end item buffer lead time. If we buffered 301, for example, we would impact the 201 buffer lead time, but we wouldn't impact the FPB lead time. Therefore, we would still have to hold the same amount of inventory at FPB, even if we buffered 301. So we really need to understand, is the item that we're buffering on the decoupled lead time, because that's where we can have an impact in the lead time of the buffered item at the top, which is our highest dollar item. Therefore, that's the one we're trying to reduce if we can. The second step is protect, and this has to do with buffer profiles and levels. The buffer, this is your introduction to the buffer. Each zone of the buffer, it's a 3-zone buffer, and each zone has the reason for existing or a purpose and a separate calculation that goes along with that. The green zone has to do with order size and frequency. The yellow zone is the primary coverage, what we sometimes call cycle stock. It is the demand during the lead time. And the red zone is the safety embedded in the buffer. That's our protection in case there is trouble. The items that the content that goes into creating those buffers is things that we know about: the item type, the lead time, the minimum order quantities, the average daily usage, and the lead time category and the variability category. Those are a little bit new, but they're not completely new, where we talk about a long lead time or a high variability. The average daily usage sounds very simple, but how we calculate that average daily usage can become very complex, or at least can be, there's different reasons why we would consider different time frames to figure out what our average daily usage is. And with those items, we calculate the zone and buffer levels for each part. As an example, and some things we don't cover in this basics, where we talk about demand adjustment factors. So there are things that we don't talk about. We have an average daily usage of 17, the lead time of 21 days. We have an order multiple or a MOQ of 300, and a buffer profile assignment that says this is a purchase part with a long lead time and high variability. And accordingly, we create factors for a lead time factor and variability factor. We put those together, we end up with a green zone of 300, a yellow zone of 357, and a red zone of 233. MRP was not designed to manage stock positions, designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator. MRP nets to 0. In other words, we don't want to have anything left when we're done. DDMRP never nets to 0. We are supposed to hold inventory at the strategic positions we have determined. The one thing I want to point out here is this is not a position of inventory. This is a buffer that we can then use to compare when we calculate to understand how much do we order and when do we order it. This is not the value of our inventory. It's a little bit like a Kanban system where you might have 10 Kanban cards, each worth 100. You don't expect to have 1,000 parts on your shelf at any given moment. But if everything falls apart and your demand dries up, but your supply fills in, you would end up with a maximum of about 1,000 parts on your shelf. This is similar. This is some equations that we've put together to figure out a planning buffer. And yes, if demand dries up and supply keeps coming in, we would end up with this on our shelf. But in general, we want to be, in this case, somewhere between 233 and 383 would be our expected range of inventory balance, not 890 if we did the math here. It is not safety stock. It is not duct tape. It is not a fire alarm. It is not a fire extinguisher. It is more of a firewall. Again, decoupling, separating the rate of use from the rate of supply creates a firewall and protects the variability from transferring all the way through the supply chain. It stops at the buffers as long as it's not a crazy amount of variability. We end up with a buffer profile matrix of a minimum of 36 parts, assuming you have purchased, manufactured, distributed, and intermediate manufactured parts. You would end up with 36 with combinations of purchased, short lead time, and low variability, for example, to get a PSL. The calculations for each of the zones. Let's start with the yellow zone, which is simply the average daily usage times the decoupled lead time. Gives us the yellow zone. That's the cycle stock or the demand during lead time. The green zone has 3 different ways to be calculated. It's either the minimum order quantity, it's a desired or imposed order cycle, or it's a calculated green zone. 3 different ways to look at it, and we choose whichever one is the highest, unless there's a reason why. For example, with a desired order cycle, you might end up with that as your green zone. And the reasoning here is that the green zone has to do with order size and frequency. So my minimum order quantity, or if I want to order every 5 days, for example, those will drive how often I will place an order. And we'll get to talk about what causes that in a little bit. The red zone is the safety that we've embedded in the buffer. 2 calculations that get added together. The red zone base is the lead time factor times the average daily usage times the decoupled lead time. The red zone safety is the red zone base times the variability factor, and then we add the 2 together to get the total red zone. Here's our example part number 1, 2, 3. We have an average daily usage of 20, an MOQ of 200. We want to order this every 7 days if we can. And we have a decoupled lead time of 14 days. We've got a variability factor. So we've got, this is a manufactured part with medium lead time and a 0.5 lead time factor, and low variability and a 0.25 variability factor. So we calculate the yellow zone. Always, always, always the average daily usage times the decoupled lead time, which in this case is 20 times 14. So our yellow zone is 280. Step 2, calculate the green zone. A little more complexity, but we start to understand that the medium lead time gives us a factor of 0.5, and that sits in between this 41 and 60%. So this is a 50% number to talk about those the same. So we've got 3 different ways to calculate the green zone. Whichever one yields the greatest number or the highest number determines the green zone. So order cycle gives us 140, lead time gives us 140, and MOQ gives us 200. So the MOQ is the highest number. So our green zone is 200. The red zone, the safety embedded in the buffer. The higher the variability associated with this part, the larger the red zone. So the red zone base is first calculated using the lead time factor, and then we apply or multiply the variability factor against that red base, and then we add those 2 together to make our calculation to get our red zone. And so we can see that we've calculated the red base using the lead time factor to get 140. we've taken 140 times our variability factor of 0.25 and got 35. We've added the two together and got 175 as our total red zone. So what happens? We have a red zone of 175. We have a yellow zone of 280. So top of yellow is the red plus the yellow, or 455. And the top of green with a 200 green zone means we add the red, yellow, and green, and our top of green is 655. And we'll start to see why those are important little pieces of this puzzle. Again, this is a planning buffer, not the amount of inventory we will hold at that spot. Quick reference summary, we've got our order cycle, lead time factor, or MOQ. We don't always have all three of those. If you don't have an MOQ and you don't have a desired order cycle, then you use the calculated green zone. Maybe you have an MOQ and a lead time factor. Maybe you don't have the order cycle. Whatever combination you have, that's what we use. The yellow zone is always the same calculation, and the red zone takes into account variability from the lead time and then adds in the variability of either demand or supply and takes that into account in the red zone. So the job becomes, once we've decided where we're going to hold inventory, is maintaining that buffer. We want to make sure we always have inventory in those strategic locations. Now, the dynamic adjustment that happens means that the buffer levels flex as the average daily usage is updated, or the lead time is updated, or the variability factor or the lead time factor updated. If those things are updated in the system, automatically the buffer recalculates and it flexes. So in this case, with the demand changes, with the ADU changes, the buffer has started out kind of small and has grown to be larger. We can also use demand adjustment factors where we might have business intelligence knowledge or experience with these parts. And we say, in somewhere here, there's a seasonality or there's a little promotion happening. Something is causing our demand to go up and then come back down for a relatively stable part. And we can adjust that buffer if we know about it. And so in anticipation of planned events or seasonality, then we can plan for that and adjust the buffers to be able to absorb that variability. Most conventional safety stock and reorder point positions are static, not dynamic. But in either case, we are using the demand-driven buffer as a planning tool all the time for those parts that we've strategically buffered. If we look at the demand adjustment, if we have no demand adjustment, we see the buffer rides along pretty constant. But if we see or we expect that an average daily usage is going to go up and there's going to be some seasonality here, we can multiply the original average daily usage by a factor. And in this case, we went up 80%. So a factor of 1 means there's no adjustment. Factor of 1.8 means we're going to add 80% to the average daily usage. And we see what happens to the buffer. So if there's a big spike coming, and then if, for example, it's a product where people are just buying ahead and over the next weeks they're going to buy less, then we're going to drop that down. So we can do a demand adjustment factor that is below 1, which means we're going to reduce it, or a factor that's higher than 1, which means we're going to increase the buffer. The demand-driven planning piece starts with getting a more relevant demand signal instead of the conventional master production schedule, material requirements planning connection, where we create planned orders based on a forecast that we know is wrong to drive our activity today, versus DDMRP, where we want to use only qualified sales orders within a short range horizon as demand allocations. And having said that, there's a difference in the way we use forecasts in DDMRP because we put it into the calculation of the buffer if we're looking forward beyond the point where we have demand, where we have qualified sales orders. So we can use forecasts when we're looking forward, but we're not trying to tie the exact precise forecasted number, which we know isn't going to be the right number anyway. We're not trying to tie that to our actual order placement or resource scheduling that's happening today. Because the sales order is highly accurate, the planned order is highly inaccurate. And then we come with a more relevant supply order generation equation. The net flow equation, questions that every planner and every buyer cares about each day, is what is on the way to me? What have I ordered that's not here yet? What do I have on hand? What's my on-hand balance? What demand am I trying to fulfill immediately? And what future demand is relevant? The net flow equation is daily applied and understood, and that will help us understand how much we're going to order and when we're going to place an order. Very simple equation. What do I have on hand plus my open orders that I don't have yet minus my qualified sales order demand? I compare that to the buffer. Again, I've called this a planning buffer. I compare the outcome of my net flow equation, which we call the net flow position, to the buffer. If it's in the yellow or the red, I place an order up to the top of the buffer. That sounds like a process around how much do I order and when do I order it. But there's a question. What is qualifying demand? And this is where it gets a little hard sometimes for most of us to wrap our heads around. Qualified demand is what's due today, anything that's past due, which we don't have in this example, and a qualified spike. How do we determine a qualified spike? We set an order spike horizon and an order spike threshold. So what's the number we're looking for that we would call a spike? And how long into the future are we looking? We set that, and we only include in that qualified demand segment of the net flow equation the items that have a daily bucket that exceeds that order spike threshold. Normally, most people I talk to, and in my own history, when we were trying to figure out how much to order, we were looking at all the orders between now and the next and the lead time of the part. So we would take into account all of these orders. But because we've buffered and we've set the buffer to be able to handle regular demand, we don't have to go look at each one of these. We can just worry about the spikes that are happening and only look at the spikes that are within, in this case, the decoupled lead time. But wherever we've set that order spike horizon, that's where we want to consider the qualified demand. A couple examples just to highlight this, that we have 3 orders, three orders due on the same day. Therefore, if we add those up, they exceed our spike threshold of 100. And so we're going to include those in the qualified spike in the net flow equation. We have spikes out here, but they're outside of the horizon. So we're not going to consider those yet. We'll consider them in a couple of days when that slides inside of that order spike horizon. All right, how do we calculate the net flow position? Scenario 1, I have on hand 105. Scenario on order, I have 240. So on hand plus on order minus the qualified demand means that I have 325 as my net flow. It's clearly in the yellow, but not deep into the yellow. And so I will order up to the top of green. So this is part of where we can understand that the green zone has to do with our order size and frequency, because if the net flow is in the green, we don't order. And as soon as it breaks into the yellow, we do order, and we order up to the top of green. So if it breaks slightly like this one does, we'll place an order for 130, the green zone is 120. So you see the connection between how much we're going to order and the green zone. In scenario 2, we have on hand 140, on order 255, qualified demand of 20. That means we're going to have a net flow of on hand plus on order is 395, minus 20 is 375. 375 when compared to the buffer, if we look at our top of yellow, which is 335, right? 240 plus 95. So 335 is my top of yellow. That means my net flow in scenario 2 is up here in the green zone, so we don't place an order at all. Our minimum order quantity becomes the green zone. Even if we don't have an MOQ, we will never order less than the green zone in most cases. So the net flow equation is performed every day on all buffered items. We're not going to order every item every day. Only the item where the net flow position is in the yellow or red are ordered, and they're ordered up to the top of green. If we look at a planning grid for DDMRP, for part number 401P, which means it's a purchase part, we look at the top of red at 2438, top of yellow at 8938, top of green at 10,888, and our net flow position becomes on hand plus on order minus the qualified demand, or 7833. Now we introduce a concept called planning priority, which is the net flow position divided by the top of green. So 7833 divided by 1088 gives us our percentage, but we also need the color. So 7833 lands in the yellow zone because top of yellow is 8938. So 7833 is below the top of yellow. So the planning priority is yellow at 79.1%. And the order recommendation, because we're in the yellow zone, we're going to order up to the top of green, which means we take our top of green minus the net flow position, and we get an order for 3,055. And the request date in this case, because today is the 15th of July and we have a 10-day lead time, the request date is July 25th. So let's look at a day in the life of the planner and what, using DDMRP, what my day looks like if I'm a buyer or a planner. So let me set the stage with the buffer is essentially on today, and -1 and 1. So 1 is what we're shipping today, -1 is what is arriving today from the supply orders. So what we need to ship today and what we are receiving each day is on either side of the buffer. And when I push the advance button, everything slides in towards the buffer. Okay, so let's look at day 1. On day 1, we have an on hand of 65, which we're giving to you. We can see what we have on order, which is 37 plus 35 or 72. And we have a sales order demand of 10, because as we look forward, that's what's due today. We have no past dues, and there is nothing that exceeds the spike threshold through the decoupled lead time, which is how far we're looking. And we can see the graph happening down here. What's our on hand at 65, and what is our net flow at 127? We are in the green, so we are not going to place an order. On day 2, we still have on order 72. A spike came in on day 8, which is now inside of our order spike horizon. So our sales order demand is 18 plus the spike of 30 or 48. On hand is 55, which is still in the yellow zone. On hand plus on order minus the qualified sales order demand gives us a net flow of 79, which means we're going to order, because we're in the yellow, we're going to order up to the top of green. So we're going to place an order for 78. Now on day 3, our on order has jumped to 115, 78 plus 37. Our net flow is 140 because our on hand plus on order minus the sales order demand jumps us up to 140. How did we get our on hand balance to go up? I didn't mention that. What we're receiving today is 35. We shipped out 18. So we had 55 plus 35 minus 18 gives us our on hand of 72. On day 4, our net flow is still in the green. So we're not going to place an order. We still have our same order quantity out here. And we have a sales order demand of 6 plus the spike. So sales order demand of 36. But we're not going to order again. Day 5, still in the green, not placing an order. Our on hand has dropped to 49, which is in the red from a planning perspective. And we may or may not get to that in today's lesson, but it's in the red. Maybe we're a little concerned, but probably not too much. Day 6, my net flow is 120. My on hand's a little bit deeper into the red. My sales order demand is 39 because I've got 9 today and 30 of a spike. And my on order is still the same at the beginning of day 6. But what's my on hand at the end of day 6? 44 minus 9 plus the 37 that are arriving. So my on hand balance came out of the red zone. My net flow, every time net flow drops into the yellow, we place an order up to the top of green. But of course, because we shipped out that day, the net flow doesn't go all the way up to the top of green. We have 72 on hand. We have 115 on order. Sales order demand of 40 because we're taking 10 plus the 30 of the spike. But our net flow is in the green at 147. We do not order. Day 8, net flow is still 147. Today we're shipping the spike. Our on hand is 62. So what's our sales order demand is the spike today, and there's no more spikes out into the future, but we don't place an order even though we're shipping the spike. Our on hand drops to 32, a little bit deeper into the red than we'd like to see, but if we look, we see that we're going to receive in 78 today. Why are we receiving in 28? Because we reacted to the spike right at the end of the decoupled lead time. So yesterday we shipped the spike. Today we're receiving the order that was generated by the spike. So even though our on hand is 32, we can look and see that we have an order coming in that's a fairly large order. If you're like me and your blood pressure is you're a little nervous about that, you might call and make sure that 78 is coming in. But if it's a supplier that always reacts on time, maybe we just accept that that's coming. Day 10, net flow is still 136. We can see our on order is only 37. We have no spikes, so the only consideration we have for sales order demand is today's shipment. Day 11, still the net flow is in the green, so we don't place an order. Our on hand is at 99. Sales order demand, again, no spikes coming in. So sales order demand is 9. Day 12, net flow has dropped into the yellow. As soon as the net flow drops into the yellow, what do? We place an order to get us up to the top of green. Day 13, we're back into the green with our net flow, so we don't place any orders. And our on hand is at 80, still in good shape. We have a higher than we've had in the recent past, an order of 20 due to ship today, but we also have an order of 37 that is coming in today. So our inventory goes up a little bit. Our net flow is still in the green, so we don't place an order. Day 15, our net flow drops into the yellow. Even though our on hand is pretty good, the net flow tells us when to order. The on hand perspective tells us when to expedite or when to react. So we're going to order 37. which means on day 16, we have 37 and 40 on order. We have a sales order demand of 10, which means we're not going to place an order, and we're not nervous about our on-hand balance either. Day 17, we have a net flow of 127. Don't need to place an order. Got sales order demand of 20. And we can see how our net flow has performed. Every time we hit the yellow, we ordered and got us out of trouble. And our on-hand balance doesn't align directly with that, but we can see that we had a couple of spots where we dipped into the yellow, dipped into the red. But most of the time we were floating along up here in the yellow. So what does that mean? It means if we look at the performance, we can see that our average daily usage over those 17 days was 11.8. We did not dynamically adjust the buffer to throw that confusion in as we went through those 17 days. We sized the buffer for 10 as an average daily usage, and we had 11.8, which is 18% higher than what we sized for. Our average on inventory was 71.6, which is not bad. And when we look at the inventory distribution, remember that in between too little and too much, our inventory distribution looks a lot different than the bimodal distribution that most companies have. So very quickly, we move away from that bimodal distribution and towards having most of our inventory distribution during the day, during the weeks, or over the time period, most of them falling in between the optimal range. And then where is our improvement coming from? Down here, where we drop below that minimum range we were hoping to keep. Why did these happen? And when we answer that, that becomes our continuous improvement list. And if we had something too far out of range here, we would say, why did that happen? And that gets added to our continuous improvement list as well. Net flow versus on hand, we see we don't really have a fantastic correlation between these events. They're different, right? The net flow is telling us when we need to place an order. The on-hand distribution is telling us when we need to expedite. And we look at them separately to understand the answers to those questions. Another innovation of DDMRP is the decoupled explosion. The difference here, if we look at the yellow items, those are buffered items on the left-hand side. And we have decoupled lead times in between many of those buffers. We have decoupled lead times. The DDMRP methodology says when the net flow position enters the rebuild zone, which we just saw examples of, when the net flow position gets into the yellow or red of a buffer, then the explosion starts. But it stops at the next stock position, no matter what. And so then 203 enters the rebuild zone, that explosion happens, and then 301, that explosion happens. All of that happens separately. The difference with DDMRP, we have smaller segments of those explosions. With traditional MRP, any change that happens in this end item demand, both the due date of it or the timing or the quantity, any change here and everything else that goes into that item, everything else has to change. And this is a major contributor to the chaos that we face running around changing due dates or quantities for everything that we do, even though it doesn't really seem like there should be a problem, right? Changing, the customer ordered 10, they changed it to 11. It's only up by 1, but everything else, all the other components also have to change. With DDMRP, the change out at that end item, the explosion only happens in between the buffers. And so the similarities here is that here in between the buffers on DDMRP and that same segment here in MRP, DDMRP and MRP work exactly the same. They both try to net to zero, and they both want to assume precision work. So everything has to change, but the much less chaos in managing 3 parts and the changes within versus changing 12 parts. And very few of us work with bills of materials that only have 12 parts in them. So imagine that's 50 parts, and every single other part changes every time there's a change to that end item. That's why we try so hard to make sure that that end item quantity and timing is exactly what it's going to be. But reality exists, and it often, no matter how hard we try, it will change or it will be wrong, and that drives the chaos. The last segment is the DDMRP execution and collaborative execution. What we're driving here is that MRP has a priority by due date. And frankly, we know intuitively that if I set a due date on a 6-month lead time item, and I think today I need to place that, then I'm going to set that due date to be 6 months from now. But in fact, very soon after I've set that due date's not valid anymore because other orders have dropped in, requirements have happened, something changes in our on-hand availability, there's a change to the timing of the order, a change to the quantity of the order. That due date isn't valid for long. DDMRP tries to switch away from due date and says, for the buffered components, I want to know my status. And my on-hand buffer status, which is different than the planning buffer status, says I'm at 27%, I'm in the red, I'm at 42%, I'm in the red, and I'm at 88%, I'm in the yellow. My most urgent item is this 27% in the red. And I can watch that over the time of the lead time. I know when I need to expedite based on this, not the constantly changing expedite requirements based on a constantly changing due date and quantities. So would you rather have a look like this where we had all the due dates, or would you rather understand if we've decided that we're going to buffer a component here, this one's at 12% in the red, even though the due date says May 14th. If we look by due date, it puts us 4th in line. But if we look at buffer status, it puts us 2nd only to the make to order part where we have an actual due date with the customer. But otherwise, we can follow a different logic to understand our prioritization. So what we end up doing is saying goodbye to the bimodal distribution, and we end up with this nice distribution of we're mostly in the optimal range, and the tails, in other words, the parts, the inventory distribution that ends up on the too high warning or the too low warning range, those become our continuous improvement activities. And we can look historically at the performance over the past tactical range and say, over the past 35 days, this product has been performing very well and staying in the range that we targeted. Is this a part that we could drop the red zone just a little bit? Maybe, but we now have the information to determine whether or not that's valid. And we have the ability to simulate and say, if I had a lower variability factor, what would this graph have looked like over that same time period using the data that I have for my company? And if I put in a lower variability factor and I rerun this chart and it's now too low, well, I'm probably not going to make that change. But I now have the data to be able to decide what is the right course of action, or at least to help me have more confidence that if I change that variability factor, if it was okay over that time period, maybe it'll be okay into the future, and I can manage that thought process. Again, how do we adapt, right? Because DDMRP is not a final solution. It's the starting point to have the information to decide the things that got me into the yellow and the red, things that got me into the yellow and the red, or even the dark reds. Those are my continuous improvement activities. So very quickly, we move from what all of us have without DDMRP, this bimodal distribution. And we move to having the initial results very quickly to having our inventory in that optimal range for the most part, and then fixing the errors or the outliers, squeezes those together, and we have fewer outliers and more items in that optimal range. Critical differences, MRP and DDMRP. MRP has no decoupling, makes everything dependent, forcing us to use longer planning horizons and creating more variability accumulation. DDMRP strategically determined decoupling points that compress the lead time and absorb the bidirectional variability. MRP was not designed to manage stock positions, designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator, which means you don't want to have anything left over after your production run. DDMRP recognizes the kind of ridiculousness of that and says, we're going to manage strategic stock positions that never net to zero at those points. Most conventional safety stock and reorder points are static, meaning they don't change. And with DDMRP, the stock buffers dynamically adjust based on the consumption and other future known events and allow us to continually adapt. MRP attempts to keep the full safety at all costs, which means if we're using safety stock, when we hit safety stock, we get a distortion in the way we apply that, because if we hit safety stock, everything is due now or before. And it's really hard to place an order today and say it was due yesterday. So trying to keep that full safety stock gives us the distortion of trying to hold that inventory and expedite unnecessarily because that inventory has been breached. DDMRP assumes that safety will be used fairly frequently. It is normal. The forecasted demand signal input guarantees constant nervousness and expedites. In traditional MRP and with DDMRP, the supply order generation is tied directly to actual demand. We don't use the master production schedule to drive precise orders or precise scheduling drives. We use it as an input into the buffer, and that the buffer then determines when we order and how much we order. MRP has priority by due date, which over longer periods of time will become less and less likely. DDMRP has priority by buffer status and allows us to adapt and adjust and be agile like we're trying to do, like it's actually required for us to do. The proven benefits of DDMRP: we improve customer service, often up towards 100% on-time delivery. We compress the lead times. We've seen situations with different companies where they've gone from an 8-week lead time to their customers to a 1-week lead time for their customers, and that can make all the difference in whether we get the order or not. We right-size the inventory, but in making sure that we don't have too much of one item and making sure that we have enough of another item. Generally speaking, overall, we end up with about a 30% reduction in inventory at the same time we are improving customer service. Those expedite costs and false signals are largely eliminated, so we don't have the cross ships, schedule break-ins, and expedited freight. So we're reducing the cost of the supply chain in that regard, And it's easy and intuitive for planners to understand the priorities instead of the constantly changing and conflicting messages of MRP. DDMRP translates across many industries, all kinds of production, fast-moving consumer goods, construction, you name it, manufacturing, all industries can use the 4 innovations that came out of DDMRP in some way or another. If you want to use a software or just put the equations into your planning processes, there are ways to utilize the gains that have been made. And when we look across industries, this has been put together by Camelot management consultants, whether we're in the overall scenario or life sciences or chemicals or consumer packaged goods or industrial manufacturing. We see differences in improvements in service level. We see improvements in lead time in terms of reductions, and we see inventory reduction as well. Overall, at 30%, we get up to 49, 32, 36, 26. All of them significant changes by simply adapting the DDMRP thought process. DDMRP is not the end. It is the first step in implementing a demand-driven operating model. And the way I like to talk about this is, if we can stop running in circles trying to make sure we have inventory because of all the changes with traditional MRP, it opens the doors to so many things. Because frankly, if you have inventory, you can, and if you don't have inventory, you can't. And you can fill in the blank on whatever it is you're trying to do, but without inventory, you can't do it. So the first step is getting our inventory management up to speed, and our, how much do we order and when do we order it? Getting those questions out of the chaotic state of affairs. After that, there's many more things we can see. So if we look at the big picture, the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model has 3 parts. And DDMRP, the operating model, is down here. And then we have a demand-driven S&OP and adaptive S&OP. And each feeds the other, right? The business plan parameters go into the demand-driven sales and operations team. They then configure the model. Is the inventory positions in the right place? Is the average daily usage set properly? Are the lead time factors and variability factors set properly? That's where the work happens. And then our demand-driven operating model still runs in the same way through the same processes once we change the model. Then we got variance analysis coming back to the demand-driven S&OP team and up to the upper leadership team, which we're calling the adaptive sales and operations planning team. We can make some projections. We can make some strategic recommendations up to the team when we don't have the authority or the checkbook to make all of the changes that we think we need to make. We move those recommendations up to the adaptive S&OP team. Actual demand feeds in on the one side, market-driven innovation on the other. So we end up with a demand-driven operating model that combines the MRP, distribution requirements planning, lean, theory of constraints, Six Sigma, and even factory physics, paces operations to the actual demand, strategically places decoupling points for lead time compression and variability, and strategically places control points for schedule synchronization. We didn't talk about control points at all up until this point. The decoupling points is the basic starting place, and then we move into control points and even time and capacity buffers to manage the buffers. The demand-driven operating model is our supply order generation piece, which we use actual demand to do. And then That creates our purchase orders and our stock transfer orders, as well as our manufacturing orders, and those feed down into the buffer management or the control point scheduling side. Again, the feedback comes up to get promise dates for our manufacturing orders and our on-hand and synchronization alerts from our buffer management. And then the release manufacturing orders go over to help maintain the buffers, and the progression of those manufacturing orders goes over back to help the scheduling side. Demand-driven sales and operations planning feeds in with their model configurations and changes that need to happen to the demand-driven operating model. And then we have a variance loop that feeds back from all the components here back to that demand-driven sales and operations planning team. DD S&OP sits between the adaptive S&OP and the demand-driven operating model. Why do we need something between there? This has always been a struggle for me. Business leadership looks at you can call it a black book process, a budgeting process, the annual review, whatever you want to call it. They come up with the strategies and the changes that are required and the expectations, right? We're going to go from 93% on-time delivery to 95% on-time delivery. Those things come out of this leadership team, which we're calling the adaptive S&OP team. Way down here in the operating model, we've got people running the equipment on the shop floor. If this team says we need to move from 93% to 95%, they say we need inventory numbers to go from 4 million down to 3.5 million. Whatever things come out of here, what does the person on the shop floor do to try and make those things happen? That's always been a point of contention for me. And what the reality is with demand-driven, once we've got the demand-driven operating model in place, the demand-driven S&OP team sitting in this tactical range determines through model configuration what the buffers do, and what the buffers do determines what the operator on the shop floor does. And all of a sudden, we have a communication channel and a way to understand whatever this vision is for the future can be driven through this tactical reconciliation and model configuration to answer the question, what do the people on the shop floor do to make that vision come true? That's the value and the importance of the demand-driven sales and operations planning team. So DD-S&OP drives the tactical reconciliation. And what does that mean? It means we can move from the traditional view of sales and operations planning, which is completely a linear process, and always starts with demand and the demand review, and then drives everybody else, all the supply team, to try and figure out how to make that happen. With with demand-driven S&OP, and because of DDMRP, we can actually start with what are our capabilities as a company? What are we capable of? And then we can look at what needs to happen in the tactical range. How does the model need to perform differently? Are there improvements that need to happen? What are the metrics that we're trying to improve? And then we can look into the future and say, if we make these changes, then this is what's going to happen. And oh, by the way, there's a change. There's a new distribution center opening in 6 months. Whatever those changes are, we can begin to prepare for those as we look at the evolving and the agility of the operating model. We can look at exploitation. What are some supplements that we can do in the short range to improve flow? Can we make some changes early on here in this chart? We can see we've got capacity in the first days, but we're overloaded out here. Can we move some things around and make that happen? And then what are strategic recommendations? Things like we need some more lathes, or we need another piece of equipment, or we need a bigger warehouse, or we should maybe move a distribution center to a different area or add a second distribution center, whatever those kinds of things that we are going to now be able to see because we're monitoring our inventory differently, those kinds of recommendations come out of the demand-driven sales and operations planning team. And then we look at projection, say, if in fact you predict that we're going to increase sales by 50%, we can now decide what's going to happen or what's going to need to happen in order to manage that kind of an expected change. So adaptive S&OP, this is the same chart we saw a little bit ago. Got our adaptive S&OP that feeds into the demand-driven S&OP and then feeding back our model projections, any innovations we can see, and any strategic recommendations we can make. And what really happens in the world we live in today? We've got a strategic range, which is typically looking forward, 1 to 2 years, let's call it. That's typically the way we think of it, though we learn through demand-driven that that's not really the right one-size-fits-all solution for everybody. But let's think 1 to 2 years into the future. Based on that, we create a forecast, which drives into a master production schedule, which is in the tactical range, which we think of as maybe quarterly or every 6 months kind of a time frame. And then that drives down into MRP in the operational range, which is what are we doing today? And we start to see that S&OP has always been about projecting ranges of numbers. But the conventional thought process and planning tools force us to use a single number as input to the master production schedule. And any connection to the range is lost. That single number that we know is wrong flows down into the MRP system. And when that number changes, everything else changes, even if that number was in the original S&OP range. This has always been a struggle point for me, is why this is a problem, why this struggles. And in fact, the problem is that inside of these different ranges, we have different needs, different assumptions that are made. And we're essentially taking all of this and putting it into one range where all the assumptions are the same, but we recognize that they are not the same. And something I wrote recently that kind of put it together for me was that as supply chain people, we know that a projection or a forecast in the future is not going to be the number that works. So we know we're planning with a wrong number, but we don't know what to do today without picking a number and putting it into our tools. Even though we know it's wrong, we don't know how else to manage. And DDMRP says, here's how else you could manage. Here's a different way to think about it. And takes away that confusion we have when we say, I know that number is not going to be correct, but I also don't know what to do except assume that that number will be correct, because otherwise I don't know what my tasks are. So what we end up with is in a traditional MRP world, what we call tactical demolition and reconstruction. Every time we came out of an S&OP monthly meeting, someone would have to go input those numbers into our MRP system. Sometimes that was me. And after that's done, the next day, everything has changed. And all of our plans, whatever we had been doing for the month before, that's all gone. And now here's a new set of things to do. And it's constantly ever changing, one-way street, because there isn't a good communication channel back and forth. There's not bi-directional communication, even though the original vision of S&OP was bi-directional communication. We didn't have a way to do it. And that's another thing that DDMRP brings, is a way to have bi-directional communication. So when the demand looks like it's going to go here, we can say the impact of that is going to be this. And are we sure that we're on the same page? And we can talk with numbers instead of our feelings. So every time MRP runs, we get changes in the schedule, we get changes in the dates and quantities of our incoming, and it connects and affects all of the lower level components, and that's our system nervousness. Reconciling the demand-driven operating model with S&OP. Let me just get all of these out on the screen. I love this slide because it talks to me about the range that should be my S&OP projections into the future. And what happens is we have to turn that into a projected average daily usage. Just like MRP, we turn that into a single number. But unlike MRP, where that single number drives your today's orders and your scheduling, we take that single number and put it into the master settings of our buffer, which creates the stock buffer. And the stock buffer, through a way to calculate the average on-hand balance and the average on-hand range, turns our inventory back into a range, a projected average on-hand range. And now we can try and tie that capability range back to the forecast range. And if it lines up, we're good. If it doesn't line up, maybe the projected ADU, maybe the master settings, something needs to change so that this range matches with the S&OP range. So we look at how the buffer can do that, goes into the master settings, gives us our total capacity and our load. So it works not only for inventory, but our capacity. If we're going to project this large change, the buffers have moved, our capacity needs have moved. So we end up with a capacity buffer that says we still have time. And there's a little note here to say, right? Most of us live in worlds where having machines sit idle is not good. But in fact, a machine sitting idle means I have capacity to make whatever variability comes at me. So if my capacity is sitting down here in the green, which means I'm not fully loaded, then I can adjust and adapt and move upwards in that capacity listing. Traditionally, we look at the colors kind of flipped on upside down. So if the machine isn't running fully, that's red. That means you got to go make sure that machine runs fully. But if you don't need the product that comes off of that machine, why are you running it to try and guess what product needs to be made? So we think about our capacity differently when we talk about DDMRP. And what we end up, I alluded to a little bit, where we have a strategic range, a tactical range, and an operational range. And the S&OP time period group of people changes those master settings that allow us to regenerate or adapt our DDMRP, our demand-driven operating model. And we look at variance analysis to go back to the master settings. And we can say, okay, we're performing well. If we make a change, will we still be okay? And that loop just keeps happening. The S&OP side, again, how's the forecast doing? That feeds into the master settings. And then our strategic recommendations and maybe operational innovations feed back up to that S&OP team. And we have two-way bidirectional conversations. So the tactical reconciliation drives adaptation through the DD-S&OP team. We get the understanding from management what the expectations are and what things need to change. We feed that into the operating model, which feeds back to the DD-S&OP team, which feeds back to the adaptive S&OP team. How do we get started with DDMRP? Well, we're all starting, if we're not already using DDMRP, we're all starting focused on cost-based operational efficiency. And we want to very quickly move to emphasize flow. If you think about theory of constraints, right? Systemic throughput is what drives our decisions, not the efficiency of a particular machine and the this kind of cost reduction idea that we have, which turns out to be kind of a myth. We don't reduce cost by making more of something we don't need. We reduce cost by making exactly what the customer wants. And that's determined through flow-based operational efficiency, not through cost-based operational efficiency. Then we move to a demand-driven adaptive enterprise where we're synchronizing and leveraging operational capability to improve that flow performance. Then we continue that improvement across the enterprise and into the market. And then we get customers and suppliers involved and get a continual ROI improvement across the supply chain. Precisely wrong, if you believe that the traditional planning world can work, please get a hold of Precisely Wrong, because it intuitively, I think most of us know it can't work, but we're kind of stubborn and we want to try and continue to do what we've done in the past, and it will not work in the world we live in today. The authoritative book on demand-driven material requirements planning is DDMRP by Patak and Smith. I believe we're up to version 3 at the moment. That is a good start for a good resource for fully understanding the demand-driven operating model. We can go to demanddriveninstitute.com. There's case studies, videos, and downloads. There are plenty of places to go look and understand this. We have certification for the demand-driven planner professional. There's one missing here, which is the demand-driven operations professional. Talks more about the capacity and scheduling resources within demand-driven. Then there's the demand-driven leader professional. There's adaptive enterprise foundations professional, and there's even some kind of Six Sigma like, or the black belt concept like, to say, if you have shown that you can apply the demand-driven methodology, you can become a demand-driven supply chain professional. That is the presentation for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly enjoyed it myself. And I wish you a good day.